Hello, everyone, and good evening. This is the January 24th, 2024 meetup for the Baltimore WordPress Meetup group, and this is Data Privacy Week, where we are going to talk about privacy policies. Not the most thrilling of all topics, but it's an important one and one that can get you in a lot of trouble if you don't follow it. Before we get going with the meetup, there's just a quick announcement. Recordings will be available usually in about 2 weeks or so. If you want to speed that process up, you can contact us about sponsorship. Links that are shared in the Zoom chat will be available with the recording at the end of the video. So if you're catching the replay, check the very end of the video for the links that are shared. The Baltimore WordPress Meetup group. This is an informational group. Please use the information, products, and services that we show you at your own risk. Just because we are showing a plugin, theme, website, etc., that is not an official WordPress endorsement of that product. As always, this is Zoom, and most of us are attending from home, so make sure that we keep it family friendly. We will do our best to follow the WordPress Meetup community standards. And what that means is no spamming or spammer-like behavior. We have people of all different skill levels and backgrounds, so no judgment for people who are at a different level than where you are at. And generally, don't be a jerk. You will not receive a warning, you will just be booted. Our sponsors that we would like to thank for actually keeping this meetup running: Enfira LLC. Enfira helps companies that are serious about their WordPress development needs. They specialize in helping agencies and businesses that are frustrated by their WordPress challenges. If you need help, visit enfira.com/help. And I'll be dropping the links into the chat as we go. The next sponsor is Easy Alley Guide. They work to make web accessibility easier to understand and easier to get started with through tools and processes. For more information on web accessibility, introductory tutorials, tools, and more, please visit easyalleyguide.com. And our final sponsor that we have to thank is OB Digital Consulting. They sponsor our video recordings and prepare them for YouTube. So if you have video production needs, please contact them. Some quick admin before we get to our presentation. Find your Zoom chat. We will be using the Zoom chat for quick questions and to queue people up. If you have questions during the presentation, toss them into the Zoom chat. If you want to actually ask your question out loud, you can just put a question mark or say that you would like to ask your question out loud. Your video will remain turned off as I have disabled it for you. That way, people who have less than ideal internet connections can still enjoy the presentations. No one knows everything, so we'll do our best to answer your questions, but we can't guarantee having answers to everything. Since this is a legal topic, a quick disclaimer. This is general information. I am not a lawyer. I'm definitely not your lawyer, and this is not any official legal advice. So what we are going to talk about today is a new European Union requirement. What kind of demand letters businesses are actually receiving regarding privacy policies? What about privacy policies that you don't know that can hurt you financially? What laws in the US affect your websites? What international laws affect your websites? Terms of service requirements that are in existence that require you to have a privacy policy on your website. Why you should not ask a business attorney for help with privacy law, who you should ask for help with privacy law, and how to build a privacy policy. So first up, we have a new European Union requirement called the Digital Markets Act. This is a new law in the EU that affects cookie notices on websites. This specifically came out of some legal trouble that Google had. So if you are using a platform such as Google AdSense, where you display Google ads on your website, then you have to have a Google certified consent management platform for EU residents. So if you have EU people who can visit your website, and you serve Google Ads on your website, you have to comply with this. If you don't, Google will turn off your ads. For more information about what all that is and what all that means, I've put the link in the chat. Now, an ongoing trend that has been happening now for a couple of years is these demand letters. Businesses are receiving demand letters and they're coming out of the blue. People are like, well, what is this letter? Why did I receive it? It might be coming via email. It has even come to people via physical mail. And it basically starts out, to whom it may concern, my name is such and such, and I'm a resident of somewhere in California. And they have some questions regarding how you handle GDPR, which is an EU regulation. Technically, they should be discussing the California privacy laws, not the European Union ones, but then they ask a few questions about how you process GDPR and how they can get access to it. So what you should do, if you get one of these, don't panic. People are actually allowed to ask you about your privacy policies. What you should do is read your privacy policy so that you know what it actually says and to make sure that it actually contains the answer. If it doesn't, you need to rapidly rectify that situation and make sure it does contain a good answer, and then just reply with a link to your privacy policy. The financial risks of privacy violations. So different privacy laws come with fines. And quite frankly, some of these laws have significant fines. The fines for some laws are $2,500 to $7,500 per website visitor from that locale. Those are hefty, hefty fines. And since this can be potentially a moneymaker, there are some states that are starting to get their ducks in a row to have departments which will actually pursue websites for privacy violations. And since businesses have to register with the appropriate states, these states have a built-in list of people to target. So it is important that you actually get your ducks in a row and get your privacy policy. Laws in the US. So 7 new laws were added. Not all of them go into effect in 2024. Some of them are going into effect in 2025, but it's important to be aware of them. So a quick rundown of the laws and their appropriate states. I'm not going to read out every single one of these. I will just list off the states. So California, Nevada, Delaware, California again, because they have 2 separate laws. Their second law is also requires cookies if you fall under that law. Colorado, Connecticut, Utah. Utah law went into effect in December 31st of 2023. So technically it didn't go into effect in 2024, but it pretty much did. Virginia, Iowa, Indiana, Tennessee, Montana, Texas, Oregon, Delaware, and New Jersey will just passed one literally this month, and it will go into effect in January of 2025. That is how fast these states are creating these new laws. The US attempted to create a national law, but they were unable to get their ducks in a row. So all of the states have taken it upon themselves to create all of these. And there are literally over a dozen states that have laws at some point in their process. And I'm sure at least a couple of those will be passed by the time I do this presentation next year for next year's Data Privacy Week. California. California is a very litigious state, and they like to make a lot of laws. So California has 2 laws. One is called CalAPA, and the other is called CPRA. CalAPA applies to pretty much everyone. If you are collecting any sort of data on people, and if you have a website, you're collecting data. Websites have what are called access logs, and this literally records every single IP address that is coming to your website and accessing it. This is stored somewhere on the server. Depending on the type of hosting you have, you may have access to these logs, or only your hosting company may have access to these logs. But either way, this information is being recorded, and since it is on your website, you need a policy that tells them that. If you have a large company, i.e. if your revenue is 25 million or more, then you are likely under the umbrella of CPRA, and with that comes a cookie consent law. As far as I know, that is the only cookie consent law in the US at the moment. On to Nevada. Nevada has their 603A, and this law applies to websites that collect any personally identifiable information, or PII, of Nevada consumers. And it does include fines. And Nevada has started to consider putting together a division to actively pursue people who are violating their law. California has already started to put together a division, but given the speed of government, it will probably take a couple of years to fully get going. Delaware has two different laws, DOPPA, and this basically affects almost every website. And as Delaware is literally our neighboring state, it is quite likely that people from Delaware will visit our websites. The second one applies to businesses that process the personal information of 35,000 residents or more from Delaware, or it applies if you process the personal data of 100,000 residents of Delaware and you derive 20% or more of your gross revenue from the sale of that data. So hopefully you are not selling lots of data. The next laws we can kind of group together: Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia. These are almost exactly the same law, just applying in different states. If you have 25 million or more in revenue, if you control or process the personal data of 100,000 state residents or more, or if you derive 50% or more of your annual gross revenue from the sale of personal information of more than 25,000 residents. Next up is Iowa, Indiana, and Tennessee. This is extremely similar to the previous laws regarding having 100,000 state residents that you control or process their data, or if you derive a significant portion of your income from processing data. Montana, it's got a little bit lower threshold. If you've looked at the population of Montana, it is not very big. So their threshold is a little lower at 50,000. Oregon and New Jersey are basically the same law that we saw before. The revenue percentages are slightly different. So if you are dealing with a lot of people's information, you do need to watch these specific numbers. Texas is a very confusing one. The Texas law exempts nonprofits and it exempts small businesses as defined by the Small Business Administration. However, the Small Business Administration has 35 pages of lookup table that you have to go through to figure out whether or not a business qualifies as a small business. If you only have like 5 employees and you're doing less than $1 million in revenue, you're fine. But once you start getting over 2 million in revenue, you are going to need to consult the tables and find out where exactly your industry and your specific industry lands as whether or not you are defined as a small business, because it might be based on number of employees and it might be based on revenue, and those numbers vary immensely between different industries. Now we are going to talk about laws from around the world. International privacy laws. So one of the biggest ones is always GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, out of the EU or European Union. The UK, not to be left out, has their own Data Protection Act. Canada has both a national law, and Quebec didn't think that that covered enough, so Quebec also added one. And Australia has had a privacy law since 1988. Very progressive over there. GDPR in the European Union. It has made a lot of news all over the world, so you've probably seen it at least in passing. And it is extraterritorial, which means that it does affect US websites. If you offer goods or services to EU residents, or you monitor the behavior of EU residents, then you do need to worry about having GDPR language in your privacy policy. So basically, unless you have specifically blocked, the rest of the world except for the US from your website, you probably need to worry about this. The UK Data Protection Act applies if you offer goods or services, and again, if you monitor their behavior, which means if your website has access logs and you're logging IP addresses, which basically every single website does. You may not be able to access it based on your hosting, but your hosting is in fact logging all of that information. Canada has the two laws, their national one and the one from Quebec. Their laws are, of course, extraterritorial, so they do affect US websites. We, of course, do get, quite a bit of Canadian tourism in the US, so it is quite reasonable to assume that Canadians would be visiting our websites. The national law applies if you collect Canadian personally identifiable information during the course of commerce. So this is specifically if it is for the sale of services or items. If it is purely an informational blog and you're not selling anything, it doesn't affect you. If you're a nonprofit, it doesn't affect you. It's about commerce. The Quebec law, however, applies if you are caring about an enterprise. So that will affect pretty much everyone. The Australia Privacy Act of 1988, it is a rather narrow law, and it focuses just on those who do business in Australia. So for the most part, it doesn't tend to affect US businesses. Further reading, if you want to read more about these different laws, including nice detailed explanations on them, I will drop the links into the chat. Tools and terms of service that require privacy policies. Now, when you make a contract with another entity, for example, Google Analytics, when you go to Google Analytics and you click through and you create a property there, you have signed a terms of service agreement, which is a contractual obligation with Google. Pretty much any of these analytics providers or the heat map providers, they require you to sign their terms of service, and those terms of service require that to use their product on your website, you must include specific language in your privacy policy. If you don't, that's a terms of service violation, and those terms may include penalties and legal action. So Google Analytics 4. It was ruled in Europe that Google Universal Analytics was not GDPR compliant. However, Google Universal Analytics ended last year. Now it is only Google Analytics 4. So far, Google Analytics 4 has been doing okay in Europe, but it hasn't really been fully tested out in court. There is the new Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework that was signed by President Biden in 2022, and then it was ratified over in Europe in 2023. And that actually puts in an agreement between the US and Europe, allowing companies to do business far more easily and enacting some privacy constraints on what US law enforcement is allowed and is not allowed to do with information about European residents. That was the big problem previously, was that the US law enforcement basically didn't care that GDPR existed and would collect as much data as they wanted about European residents. And GDPR does not allow that. So that was a significant point of friction between the US and the EU. But this new Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework, the purpose of that is to allow European residents to have their protections from US law enforcement. All right, ways to get a privacy policy. The first way is to hire an attorney to write it for you. The attorney you do not want to talk to is your general business attorney. General counsels for business know a whole lot about general business concerns. If you want them to make you an LLC, talk about sales tax laws, that is their bread and butter. They generally don't know anything about online privacy law. In fact, many of them have never even heard of it. So don't talk to them. If you do want to have an attorney create a privacy policy for you, you need to find an IAPP certified attorney. IAPP is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. These are people who have actually read privacy laws and hopefully understand them. So if you want to have a privacy policy written by an attorney for you, that's great, but you need to make sure they are IAPP. Otherwise, they likely don't know anything about privacy law. Another option for getting your privacy policy is to have a company that specializes in privacy generation. And the one I'm going to talk about is called Termageddon. So Termageddon, the president is Donata. She's a licensed attorney, certified information privacy professional, vice chair of the American Bar Association's e-privacy committee, and chair of the Chicago chapter of the IAPP, which means she basically lives and breathes privacy law 24/7. So the reason that we use Termageddon is that Donata writes the policies, reviews them, writes the frequently asked questions, writes a whole bunch of really great informational articles, several of which I've already shared in the chat, and just stays constantly up to date, living and breathing privacy law. I have also looked over the policies that their generator creates, and they are definitely much cleaner and superior to many of the other online services. Some of the other online services, I looked at these privacy policies and I'm like, it randomly broke off in the middle of a sentence. This doesn't look right. And they are constantly updating their policies as each of these new laws get enacted. And as we've seen, multiple new laws are literally being enacted every year. So constantly updating privacy policies is very important. And I have worked with their support several times, and it has been wonderful. They are available for websites based in the United States, Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So if you are interested in getting your privacy policy generated by them, I have a link, which is a 20% off coupon. They also have a really handy bill tracker on their website, which tells you all of the current laws that are happening and in process right now. So I'll just quick pull this up. So this is a very long and detailed map telling you about the different types of things that they include. And as we can see here, we have Georgia, 3 for Hawaii, Illinois, 2 for Kentucky, 2 for Maine, 3 for Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Hampshire, 1, 2, 3, 4 for New York. That sounds about right for New York. North Carolina, Oklahoma, 3 in process for Pennsylvania, Washington, and 2 for Vermont. More of these will be ratified in 2024. It's pretty much a guarantee. It's just which ones will they be and what exactly will they include. So to quickly sum up what we talked about, there is a new EU requirement that applies to people who are using Google AdSense. Businesses are getting demand letters asking about their privacy policies, and they need to have a privacy policy in order to respond. There are starting to be actions within the states where they are going to set up departments to actually hunt down people who are violating their privacy laws. And as those different privacy laws have significant fines associated with them, once those departments get up and running, this could definitely cause you a lot of financial harm. We talked about the different laws in the US that affect your website. We talked about international laws that affect it. And we talked about contractual obligations such as analytics services and heat map services, which require that you disclose their use and may even require very specific language for that tool in your privacy policy. If you're going to get a privacy policy from an attorney, you need to get one from an IAPP certified attorney, because most general business attorneys don't really know anything about privacy law. And if you want to build a privacy policy without the expense of an attorney, you can do it with a less expensive solution such as Termageddon. So, are there any questions? The chat is open. If you want to verbally ask your question, just put a little question mark in the chat and then I will unmute you. Since there aren't any questions, we'll move on. We have some information about the group on the website, and I just have a little page up on my website for the group, and I'll put that link in the chat. And it has information about how to get help outside of meetup times. Our next meetup is scheduled for February 13th at 7 p.m. Eastern. It will be our bi-monthly, semi-monthly? I think it's bi-monthly. Ask Me Anything, for which you bring the questions, I attempt to answer them. After that, we have a meetup on February 28th, and this will be at a different time. This is at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and it will be Introduction to Web Accessibility, talking about the basics of web accessibility and how that can impact your website. The beginning of this year has been devoted to, well, regulatory stuff. Oh, we have a hand raised. Mike. Hi, Mike.
It won't let me do the video. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I thank you for this. I went to your one last week, was very informative on the PCI stuff. And
Oh, good.
I'm surprised I haven't been coming to this meetup. There's 6-8 people in this group that follow us around, and we appreciate your meetup. So my question is, how is it that the European zone or Canada can enforce laws on US citizens? How does California tell people in Washington or in Baltimore, why do they have to comply? And I've asked this multiple times and nobody seems to have an answer other than you're going to have to defend lawsuits and you better do it no matter what. But I don't understand how another country can impose their will on people inside the United States. How does the Eurozone impose
It's the
will?
same way that the Eurozone sues Google. So, for example, Google and Facebook are not based in Europe, but they do business there. They collect information about people who live there. And when Europe gets sufficiently annoyed with a company in the United States, there's a whole legal framework and extradition treaties and all of that between the European Union and the United States, which means that if the European Union sues someone and says, you got to show up to our court, US will allow Europe to enforce that law,
So
including actually putting financial sanctions on US companies.
So it's a failure of our government to protect US sovereignty then.
You can take it up however you would like, but it is a worldwide agreement between many different countries that allow people in one country to come after someone in another country because they were doing business in their country. And that is the same framework that is used, for example, when someone in California sues someone in Maryland. You know, someone can sue you, for example, I have the slide up for the Introduction to Accessibility. In that one, I will be talking about the lawsuits that are coming out of New York City. People in New York City are suing people in other states in New York courts because the website is available, the products and services are available for sale to New York residents. So New York judges are allowing them to sue people in other states. And those people in other states have to show up with representation in New York. They are served legal documents in their own state. I had spoken with someone who was in California. They were served documents from the New York City Circuit Court.
Yeah, I'm aware about that.
And they had to hire legal representation in New York to handle the issue.
All right. Well, I appreciate you answering the question. And I'm aware mostly it's happening in California, but I figured it was going to be happening in New York as well because those
New
2-0.
York is actually suing far more than California.
Okay, I was unaware of that. And I'm in a couple of New York.
So in California, there is something called the UNRRA law. And the UNRRA law is actually part of what makes people get threatening letters first instead of lawsuits first. And so in
Can you-
many cases, they're able to handle the threatening letter without it actually going to a lawsuit,
Can
which
you
is why
spell
there are
that?
fewer lawsuits filed in California. New
Can you,
York doesn't have that.
can you spell that?
And I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. No, that's a very good answer. Appreciate you being patient with me and answering that. And a great presentation. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, were there any other questions? Otherwise, we are at our last slide. All right, well, I hope everyone has a good evening and enjoy the rest of your week.